Hey everybody, welcome to my presentation of a few ideas that Peter Singer underscores in his book One World Now, The Ethics of Globalization, which seems to entail a globalized ethics with an emphasis on effective altruism. A global ethics would entail broadening our ethical considerations beyond national boundaries and extending them onto the entire world. And Singer expresses this need for a shift in our ethical thinking as global issues develop and are increasingly brought to our attention. I think this is important stuff, and I believe he's right to be thinking forward. In most cases, we're slowly coming to a point in humanity where technological advancements provide informational tools that enable us to realize that we are really just human beings living in different places. And Singer talks about the rate at which information is currently distributed being unprecedented and technological advances only seeming to be rapidly increasing. And he thinks that this has the potential to cause a massive breakdown of tribalism across the globe. He speaks favorably of ridding ourselves of the tribal ways of thinking that we've evolved by shedding geographical, political, and economic boundaries. These boundaries are hurdles in Singer's mind. Informational hurdles, geographic hurdles, and one at a time we have a moral obligation to make it to one world, one hurdle at a time. Before I forget, I want to note that I appreciate that he acknowledges the potential corruption implied by a world government. He makes it clear that he isn't suggesting that we rush into federalism. Rather, he's getting at accepting the diminishing of state boundaries while attempting to take a pragmatic step-by-step approach to greater global governance. I'll get back to to tribalism in a minute. I'm trying not to jump around too much. Global governance. Let's start there. Singer thinks that global governance is necessary due to global issues that are developing, like I mentioned earlier. So we can jump into those, starting with greenhouse gas emissions, which Singer seems to think is one of the most important global issues he's trying to tackle. He says that we have one atmosphere, which is to say that it's not like the US is polluting a different atmosphere than China. So it's going to be more sustainable if we're both working towards the same goal, or at least within some mutual understanding of one another. So Singer's trying to get the ball rolling, asking the hard questions like what would be an equitable distribution of dealing with atmospheric pollution. He broaches different solutions, pollution per capita, talking about developed countries taking a brunt of the burden. No matter what solution you pick, a global effort's going to be required. Singer seems to prefer an equal per capita right to pollute. However, he does acknowledge that it's going to be both difficult to measure this as well as to enforce it. So other global problems that Singer addresses requiring global attention and thus a shift in our ethical considerations include the ongoing refugee situations. He mentions how the global economy gives rise to the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, International Criminal Court. There already exists global economic governance, and we accept the idea that we have the responsibility to protect one another from genocide and other crimes against humanity, which indicates that we are living in a global community. And he seems to be beckoning us to embrace this fact by shedding our nationalist pride and our incessant consumptionism. Where we're born is random. Singer maintains the fact that many of us take pride in that is foolhardy. This leads me into tribalism quite well. Singer makes the point that throughout most of human evolution, people lived in small tribes, bands of closely connected and related people who hunted and gathered and only concerned themselves with the well-being of their own tribe. There was no reason, no evolutionary advantage, so to speak, for worrying about foreign tribes when one's own tribe was at risk of not making it. We and our primate ancestors formed these tribal mentalities over thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and throughout most of that time, we struggled against, among many other things, starvation. Therefore, our bodies have evolved to store anything that we eat in excess. And now that we live in a society where the norm is to stuff our faces, we've only been here for a fraction of a percent of our evolutionary history. We have no good natural mechanism for dealing with the thousands of calories that we consume every day. Modern rates of overconsumption being just another example of how evolution can't always keep up. Our evolutionary past is so deeply etched into our being that we've wound up ill-equipped for life in modern or future times. In the same way that we've evolved in small bands or tribes of people where we knew everyone, in which we were exposed to constant face-to-face interactions, we would have responded to people that we knew, and we would have been prepared to help them. And it would have been the case that strangers in other tribes would have led irrelevant lives to us. So the point is, now that we have the ability to help others across the world, Singer considers this a flaw in our psychology, that we're stuck with the tribal mentalities that we've evolved, being only or primarily concerned with our own group. Modern tribalisms manifested into state and national pride: tribe America, tribe left, tribe right, tribe Christian, tribe Muslim, tribe atheist, tribe white, tribe black, tribe Apple, tribe Samsung. The list doesn't seem to end, but I want to talk about national pride for a second, because that's something Singer takes a steady aim at throughout this book. He makes the point that nationalism seems awfully nice when we think about it as the notion of broadening our concerns beyond the more limited tribal loyalties that we've evolved over time, by recognizing that we live in a diverse nation of people who are equally deserving of the same considerations and liberties that we expect and exercise. But on the other hand, nationalism is not at all appealing when we think of it as erecting fences against the rest of the world. So what do? Do we abandon our tribe for the betterment of the world? Well, Singer says that we should preserve our relationships with family and friends, and preserve our sense of community to the extent that it's necessary. He says that we should give them some priority, and he acknowledges that everyone would save their child over the child of a stranger if it came down to that choice. But that's not the same thing as my children, my friends, my family must have the latest phones, toys, gadgets, etc. because somehow they're my kids. I can spend my excess money on them instead of spending it to help a stranger who's in need of food, shelter, clothing, vaccines that could prevent death or disease. People tend to be partial in at least some ways towards their families, friends, various tribes, as well as to those who've rendered services to them. But here we see that not only does Singer call for the breaking down of our tribal considerations, but he also rejects a great deal of our inclinations towards partiality. Singer accepts that the love parents give their children ought to be more partial than not, and he thinks that it's clear that evolution is responsible for this innate partiality that we so commonly extend into nepotism. He argues that parents who didn't care for their children didn't successfully pass on their genes as frequently as caring parents did. Therefore, this partiality for our offspring is found in all human cultures. However, he's very salient about the point that just because, quote, a certain kind of behavior is universal and has its roots in our evolutionary history, does not mean that it cannot be changed, nor does it mean that it should be changed. So it seems he is wedded to an evolutionary understanding of how we got here and what human nature is like, but he doesn't subscribe to the notion that the process of evolution has anything to do with what we ought to do as a species. In other words, how we've evolved doesn't change our current situation. Some have argued against ideas of impartiality, claiming that the moral obligations of men cannot be stretched beyond their physical powers, which is to say that humans are merely incapable of doing the kind of things Singer is beckoning us toward. The concern is that the urge to show impartial concern for all is to demand something that human beings cannot. But Singer thinks that we should accept as much partiality as is necessary to promote goods, such as parents showing some degree of partiality towards their children, or children towards their parents, or to those who have rendered service to us, but no more. He says that partiality to those who have rendered service to us is important because it encourages mutually beneficial reciprocity, and he specifies further that the partiality of parents for their children must extend to providing them with the necessities of life, and also satisfying their more important wants, and also allowing them to feel loved and protected. He goes on to note that the obligation of children towards their parents has exceptions, such as being maltreated or abandoned by their parents, and he says that it is this exception that proves the rule, in the sense that it shows that the obligation of these children towards their parents is one of gratitude, and not based on that blood relationship. He seems to make a good case for accepting some partiality within love and friendship. He talks about how loving relationships or friendships may be necessarily partial, and how for the most part these relationships seem to be, quote, at the core of anything that can approximate to a good life. He says, very few human beings can live happily and fulfilled lives without being attached to particular other human beings, To suppress these partial affections would destroy something of great value, and therefore cannot be justified from an impartial perspective. So clearly, it isn't complete impartiality that Singer is calling for. Let me try to crystallize the point that he's trying to make. He says, consider the idea that whites should care more for and give priority to the interests of other whites, or that Aryans should give priority to the interests of others of their blood. He notes that these ideas have had in their time an intuitive appeal, very similar to the intuitive appeal that the idea that we have obligations to favor family and friends, going on to assert that neither the biological nor the cultural basis for our intuitive responses provides us with a sound reason for taking them as a guide to how we ought to live. So, how ought we live then? Well, right now we seem to accept whatever conventional morality was handed down to us by the tribe that we randomly popped into, and Singer thinks we shouldn't do that. Rather, he holds that reducing suffering is easier than promoting the greatest happiness, and this, in combination with his belief that we have an obligation to help the world's poorest people, means that he's happy so long as we're improving global well-being. Singer's all about gaining the maximum utility for each available dollar, and in doing so spreading awareness of the much greater good we can do abroad. At the bottom of page 153, he says, if I, living in America, can do more to reduce inequality in Kenya by helping those at the bottom of Kenyan society than I can do to reduce inequality in my own country, then I have no grounds for preferring to reduce inequality in America. Singer holds that the best thing to do here would be to reduce inequality in Kenya because his money would go further there, and it also effectively reduces the inequality between America and Kenya as an added benefit. Singer really stresses the point that it shouldn't make a morally relevant difference whether the problems other people face, to which we have potential solutions, are right in front of us or not. It doesn't matter that we're not walking past starving children in the street. What does matter is whether or not we can reduce suffering somewhere, and he thinks that most of us can and don't. He stresses the fact that we each spend money on things we don't need, whether it's unnecessary gifts for our children, the latest phones or gadgets for ourselves. He argues in multiple places that we have an obligation to help strangers in distant lands, but I hope you all remember the part in chapter 5 wherein Singer asked us to imagine walking past a shallow pond and seeing a small child falling in, realizing she's in danger and opting to walk on due to a new expensive pair of shoes that would have been ruined, even though you could have easily waded in, pulled her out, and saved her life. Singer says, quote, it would be grotesque to allow such a minor consideration to allow or to outweigh the good of saving a child's life. Saving the child is what I ought to do, and if I walk on, I've done something seriously wrong. Generalizing from this situation, he makes the argument that the vast majority of us who are living in the developed countries of the world and who have disposable incomes are just as grotesque as the ones who walk past the drowning child due to us spending that extra money on frivolities and luxuries that we don't need to buy a new unnecessary pair of shoes when there are people in danger of dying of starvation, and when there are agencies that can, with reasonable efficiency, turn modest donations into life-saving food and basic medicines. He asks, how can we consider ourselves any better than the person who sees the child fall into the pond and walks on? I'm curious as to whether or not you guys are compelled by this argument. Maybe think about that as something to weigh in the comments. It's almost identical in conclusion to the snippet about Bob and his new car, which seems derivative of the trolley problem. Let me find it. Page 162. Bob, close to retirement, invested all his savings into a Bugatti and didn't insure it. It's got a rising market value, so he aims to sell it, live comfortably after retirement. Bob, one day out for a drive, parks the Bugatti on some tracks and decides to go for a walk. Don't question it, I know you want to. Anyways, Bob sees the runaway train with no one aboard running down the railway track, and he sees a small figure of a child playing in a tunnel, very likely to be killed by the runaway train. He can't stop the train, the child's too far away, to warn of any danger, but he recognizes that he can throw a switch that will divert the train down the track where his car is parked. Then nobody will be killed, but the train will destroy his new Bugatti, his pride and joy, and the financial security it represents. Dramatic pause. Bob decides not to throw the switch. The child is killed. But for many years to come, Bob enjoys owning his Bugatti and the financial security that it entails. What would you have done? It's pretty easy to look at the first hypothetical and think, no way. I wouldn't have even thought about my shoes. Instinct would have kicked in and I would have been in that water before I even knew it was happening. But it seems like saving the child's life in Bob's hypothetical costs a lot more than just a nice new pair of shoes. It seems more natural here to at least consider the ramifications of saving the child's life. But either way, the point Singer is scratching at is that you are in the same situation as the man who saves the car or the man who preserves his shoes at the cost of a child's life. If you think it's wrong to put shoes above the life of a child, you're a hypocrite, because we all do that every time we buy new things that we don't really need rather than giving them to charities that are effectively saving lives in developing countries. Yet we don't typically think that this is wrong. What do you folks think? Do you think we should change the standards of what it is to live ethically? Singer thinks that the standard ought to be one of sharing the fortunes of having grown up in an affluent society, with people who, through no fault of their own, are much, much poorer, and whose children are at risk of suffering from preventable diseases and dying. He puts a lot of emphasis on reducing suffering. I mentioned earlier that his view that reducing suffering is easier than promoting the greatest happiness, which I want to tie into his views on speciesism before I end this presentation. I think his views are worth engaging with, and they definitely fit well within this ethical stance he's taken. So what is speciesism? Well, the point seems to be that we ought not to give more consideration to anything on the merit of its species. Singer firmly believes that we have no dominion over other animals who are capable of suffering. It doesn't matter that the species in question has thoughts about the future or plans. That's not what Singer is concerned about here. And he does go on to point out that all lives aren't necessarily worth the same, but similar amounts of suffering are what matters here. He's all about avoiding causing unnecessary suffering. Animal testing, or not eating animals that we don't need, for example. He proposes this hypothetical to drive the point home, asking, is it permissible to perform painful or lethal experiments on a profoundly intellectually disabled human? No. The intuitive answer is no. But if no, then why is it permissible to do these experiments on non-humans? Nothing to do with cognitive ability, clearly. It doesn't matter that we have goals or achievements or social bonds. A final point to drive it home, I'll share a comment that Singer makes. Is very consistent with his notion that reducing suffering is what counts. It's his position that the human nervous system, before the second trimester, is so underdeveloped that it does not experience pain. Even if it did, if we could abort it without it feeling pain, it would not be as ethically indefensible as our willingness to kill the billions of animals with capacities far more advanced than the fetus, just because we like the taste of their flesh. Why are we privileging the fetus as a member of the species Homo sapien? That is speciesism. And that's all I got. I'm interested in seeing what you guys have to say. Thank you for your time and considerations. I miss you all and hope you're staying safe and healthy. Cheers.